They called it the Everest of rivers. Like Everest, it remained one of the last great fests of exploration. Then came 70 men with an unlikely armada of little boats. The Blue Nile rises in the mountainous heart of Ethiopia. It emerges from Lake Tana, 9,000 feet above sea level, and rushes for 500 miles towards the Sudan border through a gorge that is sometimes a mile deep. For most of its course, the river bounds over cataracts and rapids. The course of the Blue Nile is impossible to follow on foot. The sides of the gorge are too steep, and no one had ever survived a journey by water along the whole route, until a British expedition arrived at Debra Marcos, close to the source below Lake Tana. The Blue Nile couldn't have been attacked without the full support of the Ethiopian government. Ethiopia is a wild, partly untamed country where you need all the help you can get. The expedition was led by the British Army, who flew a Beaver aircraft all the way from England to do the reconnaissance work and to drop supplies. If it was to have any chance of success, the expedition had to be planned from the start as a precise military operation. The first complication was that they'd arrived in the middle of a minor civil war, so the base camp needed to be organized for defense if necessary. The leader of the expedition, Major John Blashford Snell of the Royal Engineers, had to mark out his defense plans on the top of a packing case. The team was by no means all army. The Navy was there, together with zoologists, geologists, and mapmakers. No scientist had ever managed to penetrate the Blue Nile Gorge before. The Army's job was to get them in and out safely. Safety depended almost entirely on the boats chosen for the task. Jim Masters, another engineer officer, was in charge of the boats for the first phase of the assault. Assault was the right word. These were standard aluminium Army assault boats, but they'd been specially modified to face the terrible Blue Nile cataracts after trials with models and laboratory tanks. No tanks could hope to imitate the kind of waves the Blue Nile had in store for them. Everything was lashed double tight, including the dodgers they hoped would keep out some of the water. Extra large valves had to be fitted to the rubber white water boats. This was to allow football bladders to be slipped inside. If a crocodile punctured the hull, they'd give reserve buoyancy. While all this was going on, a final aerial recce was made. The whole route had already been flown and photographed many times, but it was vital to find out daily how high the river was running. Soon after takeoff, they flew over the Tisisat Falls below Lake Tana. The expedition would have to find a way of getting at least the boats over these. Above the falls, the river splits up into a number of small channels. The problem of getting through these would be like threading your way through a maze while riding a runaway roller coaster. Lower down the river, the walls of the gorge close in rapidly. Rather like the Grand Canyon, the total Blue Nile chasm is 15 miles wide and a mile deep. The river that has carved all this runs at a terrifying speed in a narrow gorge at the bottom of it all. John Blashford Snell had chosen to lead his men down this suicidal water chute during the rainy season, when the river was highest. On the face of it, this seemed crazy. His reasoning, though, was that there would be less chance of having the bottom ripped out of the boats by rocks. Only at really low altitude could you begin to sense the power of the river. Ahead now lay Shafatak Bridge, where the first part of the attack on the Blue Nile was to begin. The expedition was to take on the easier half first, though on the Blue Nile, easy is a relative term. From Shafatek, halfway along the U-shaped gorge, the assault boats were to tackle the 280 miles to Seba. Later, the white water team would return to the source and face the really rough stuff. The assault boat's first stage was to take them through the dreaded Black Gorge, from which pessimists had told them they would never emerge. The walls that confine the river and speed the current up to 10 knots are beginning to close in, even at Shafatek Bridge. When you get your first close look at the river, Blue Nile seems a strange name for these muddy waters. It was below the bridge that Blashford Snell, resplendent in his white pith helmet, led his men into the 4 heavily laden assault boats. 8 men climbed aboard each boat, and each boat was already carrying 500 pounds of gear. From now on, they had to rely on what they carried with them, what aircraft could drop to them, and the supplies that overland parties might succeed in bringing in to chosen stop-off points along the river's course. The 32-man boat party would have stood no chance if the rest of the expedition had not been prepared to brave unmapped territory, often full of hostile tribesmen, to meet them at set points along the river. Just beyond the calm water off the beach, they could see the Blue Nile waiting to seize them. Jim Masters and John Blashford Snell sailed in the flagship Kitchener. They immediately found that even a 40-horsepower outboard could make no headway against the current. At least once they got underway, they would be going with it. From the top of the bridge, the boats look pathetically small to deal with a river that has been described as the last unconquered hell. As they hit the current for the first time, all they felt was a sense of elation. At last, they were on their way. They were committed. It was like setting out on a fast and very bumpy toboggan run. There could be no stopping or turning back. Maps were going to be of little use. No one had ever been here before to check them. There was nothing to do except sit back and let the river take them. As the pace of the river speeded up, Jim Masters and Blashford Snell in the flagship kept a constant lookout for rocks and snags. The helmsman would signal to the following boats that there was driftwood ahead. To foul a propeller in this current is to be in deadly danger. John Blashford Snell remembers how they felt as the pace began to hot up.
From the air reconnaissance, of course, we knew we were now entering the Black Gorge, and I must say it was with some foreboding amongst all of us that we did so. There had been a great many rumours about this terrible place where the water was supposed to rush through at a tremendous speed, and people were dashed to pieces, and indeed many previous expeditions had suffered a terrible fate in this gorge. In fact, hysterical people only, I think, the night before we set out from Addis Ababa had tried to warn us off, and indeed had foretold our doom. When we reached the gorge, of course, it closed in around us, and we noticed the water beginning to boil. There was no wind, it was rather eerie, and there appeared to be no living thing on the black basalt rock that stood out starkly at the side of the water. It grew darker, and apart from the noise of the engines and the hiss of the water going past, it became almost claustrophobic. People in the boat, I seem to remember, grew noticeably silent, because we all knew